A sharp cry cut through the mountain air just before sunrise. It did not come from a wolf. It came from a grown man. His boots slid across the frozen slope as snow poured around his knees. Behind him, another man clawed at a buried sled, while the wind swallowed every shouted word. The mountain showed no mercy. It only kept taking. Far above them, hidden behind a wall of rough gray stone, a young woman quietly placed another flat rock beside a small fire. She paused only long enough to listen. Then she went back to her work. If this story stays with you, stay until the end. Every stone on this mountain carries a reason, and every reason began long before that first desperate cry. Black Elk Ridge stood above the small Wyoming settlement of Red Willow, like an old judge that had watched too many winters to be surprised by another. The wind arrived there before every storm. It slid through the pine trees with a dry whistle and scraped loose snow across the rock like handfuls of salt. Most families in the valley watched the sky. Evelyn Harper watched the trees. At 18 years old, she already knew the pines spoke earlier than the clouds. That morning they leaned farther east than they had the day before. Winter was coming fast. The village square filled before sunrise. Nobody had rung the church bell. Nobody needed to. People gathered because they already knew why they had been called. Evelyn stood alone in the middle of the frozen ground. Her coat had been patched so many times that almost none of the original cloth remained. Her boots carried fresh stitching along both sides. The leather strip tying back her light brown hair had once belonged to her father. She still wore it every day. Across from her stood Caleb Turner, gray beard, broad shoulders, leader of the settlement council. His eyes stayed fixed on the folded paper in his hands instead of the young woman standing before him. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what was about to happen. Then Caleb finally spoke. The cabin now belongs to Nathan Briggs. No shouting followed, no argument, only boots shifting against frozen dirt. Nathan Briggs stepped forward without hurry. He was nearly 30. Strong enough to split logs from sunrise until dark. His wife rested one hand against her growing belly while standing behind him. The village believed a married couple deserved a home more than an orphan. That was all the explanation anyone offered. Evelyn never looked at Nathan. Instead, she looked toward the small cabin at the edge of town. Smoke still rose from its chimney. Her mother's kettle was probably still hanging above the fireplace. The rocking chair her father built still faced the eastern window. Nothing inside had changed. Everything outside had. "What may I take?" Her voice came out steady. Caleb answered without raising his head. "Whatever you can carry. No more. No less." Evelyn nodded once. She turned toward the cabin without waiting for permission. No one followed her. The little house smelled of cedar smoke and dried apples. For a moment she simply stood inside. Morning light reached across the wooden floor exactly the way it had every winter since childhood. She rested one hand against the doorway. Her father had carved small marks there every birthday. The last mark stopped at 18. There would never be another. She moved quickly. A thick wool blanket, a small sack of oats, 3 potatoes, half a jar of pork fat, a tin cup, a skinning knife with a cracked wooden handle, her father's flint striker, his old rifle. There were no cartridges left. The rifle could no longer hunt. It could still remind people to keep their distance. Behind the fireplace sat one loose stone. Her mother had hidden small things there for years. Buttons, needles, letters. Evelyn reached inside. Her fingers touched folded paper. She opened it. The ink had faded, but remained clear enough. It was a property transfer, prepared months before her mother died. Nathan Briggs' name already waited at the bottom. Only one signature was missing. Her mother's. The paper shook slightly between Evelyn's fingers. Not because of the cold, because someone had already planned this while her mother still struggled to breathe in the room above. She folded the paper carefully, then tucked it inside her coat. No one outside needed to know she had found it. Not yet. When Evelyn stepped onto the porch again, the entire village watched. Nathan avoided her eyes. His wife looked away toward the church. Only old Martha Collins held Evelyn's gaze. The older woman pressed her lips together but said nothing. Sometimes silence admitted more than words ever could. The road leaving Red Willow divided 2 miles beyond town. One trail dropped into the southern valley where strangers might offer work in exchange for food. The other climbed toward Broken Eagle Mountain. Hunters avoided those heights after the first heavy snow. Too many narrow cliffs. Too much wind. Too few ways home. Evelyn stopped where the road separated. She sat on an old split fence covered in frost. The valley promised another person's rules. The mountain promised none. She closed her eyes. Her father once spoke while repairing a saddle beside their barn. If you ever lose everything, he tightened one leather strap before continuing. Go where the land still tells the truth. She opened her eyes, then turned uphill. The climb lasted nearly 3 hours. The trail slowly disappeared beneath old snow and broken limestone. Her shoulders burned beneath the weight of the blanket roll. Cold air stung her throat with every breath. Still she kept climbing. Her father had taught her one lesson she never forgot. Never search for shelter. Search for water. Shelter usually waits nearby. Near midday, she noticed something strange. 2 pine trees leaned toward each other. The ground beneath them carried less snow than everything around it. Dark moss covered several stones. Moisture. Hidden water. She pushed through the branches. The mountain opened. A shallow rock hollow stretched beneath an overhanging cliff. Dry ground. Solid stone roof. No fresh animal tracks. Most important of all, the wind vanished the moment she stepped inside. Evelyn slowly lowered her bundle. She listened. Nothing. No howling gusts. No branches scraping. Only her own breathing. She placed one hand against the limestone wall. Dry. Cold. Strong. For the first time since leaving home. She sat down. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the pines. Inside, the mountain held still. She looked toward the narrow entrance and quietly whispered the only words she had spoken all day. I'll make this enough. Then she reached for the first stone. She had no idea that before another week passed, the same people who had watched her walk away would be staring up this mountain, praying they could still find her. The first afternoon passed with nothing but work. Evelyn never tried to make the hollow comfortable. Comfort belonged to another season. She only wanted one more sunrise. The opening faced west, leaving the inside exposed to every evening wind that rolled across Broken Eagle Mountain. Cold air flowed along the ground like invisible water, stealing warmth before it could settle around her body. She crouched at the entrance and studied the hillside. Flat limestone covered the slope from top to bottom. Some pieces were too large. Others were no bigger than her hands. She picked up the smallest stone. Then another. Then another. By sunset, she had carried nearly 200. Her palms were raw. Her shoulders trembled every time she bent down. Still, she kept climbing. Every trip made the pile higher. Every stone became another promise that tomorrow might still belong to her. Night arrived early. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed inside the hollow before darkness settled across the ridge. Evelyn struck her father's flint. The first spark disappeared. The second did nothing. The third caught a curl of dry pine bark. A tiny flame appeared. She fed it carefully with thin twigs. The little fire stayed alive. She warmed one potato beside the coals. Instead of eating quickly, she divided it into small bites. One bite. A long pause. Another bite. She forced herself to think about tomorrow's meal before finishing today's. That was how her father survived hard winters. She slept poorly. Each time she drifted off, another stream of cold air slid across the floor. The fire died before midnight. The stone beneath her blanket pulled heat away from her body, hour after hour. When dawn finally arrived, she stood with stiff legs and aching fingers. She already understood the first lesson the mountain wanted to teach. Fire was not enough. She had to stop the wind. The second day became nothing but building. She scratched shallow grooves into the frozen ground with her knife. The first row of stones rested inside those grooves instead of sitting loose on the surface. She stacked another row, then another. Halfway through the afternoon, the wall collapsed. Heavy rocks scattered across the ledge. Several bounced down the mountain and disappeared beneath the snow. Evelyn closed her eyes. She drew one slow breath through her nose. Then she started collecting the stones again. She did not waste strength arguing with failure. Stones never listened. The second attempt lasted longer. She packed frozen mud between every gap. She searched for flatter rocks instead of grabbing the nearest ones. When the wall reached her waist, it leaned slightly. Moments later, it fell inward. The crash echoed through the trees. A raven lifted from a nearby pine. Silence returned. Blood slowly ran across both of Evelyn's hands. She wrapped strips of burlap around her palms. Then she started a third time. Near sunset, the wall finally remained standing. 3 rows high, almost shoulder-width thick. Only a narrow opening remained on one side. She stepped inside, sat against the rear wall. Waited. The wind still entered the hollow, but it no longer rushed across the floor. Instead, it rose over the stone barrier before slipping out through the space above it. The air around her legs became strangely still. Only a few degrees warmer. Yet those few degrees felt larger than an entire season. She rested both hands against the finished wall, quietly nodded, then added one more stone before darkness arrived. If you've stayed with Evelyn this far, you'll soon discover that the mountain still had many lessons left to teach, and every lesson would soon matter, far beyond this lonely ridge. 3 mornings later, snow covered the entire mountainside. Evelyn's food had already become dangerously small. 2 potatoes, half a sack of oats, a little pork fat, nothing more. She needed something the mountain offered freely. She only had to notice it. While gathering firewood, she found thick green moss growing beneath an overhanging cliff where sunlight rarely reached. She pressed her hand into it. The moss bounced back instead of flattening. She carried armful after armful back to the hollow. Soon the rear corner held a thick green bed nearly 6 inches deep. She spread her blanket across it. The difference surprised her immediately. Instead of sleeping directly on frozen earth, her body rested above trapped pockets of air. That night she slept nearly 5 uninterrupted hours, the longest sleep since leaving Red Willow. The next discovery arrived by accident. Several flat slate stones had been sitting beside her evening fire. Hours after the flames disappeared, one touched her boot. It still held warmth. She stared at it for a long moment, then smiled for the first time in days. The following evening, she placed 4 flat stones directly into the fire. After they absorbed enough heat, she carefully moved them beneath the moss bed using 2 sticks. She covered them with moss and laid her blanket above them. Warmth slowly rose through the bedding long after the fire had gone dark. She whispered toward the empty hollow. "Thank you, Pa." The mountain answered only with quiet. Days became a pattern. Morning meant gathering wood. Afternoon meant improving the wall. Evening meant heating stones. Every small change made another night possible. She began studying everything around her. Which rocks stayed warm longest? Where dry branches collected after strong winds? Which patches of snow melted first beneath the winter sun? Nothing escaped her attention anymore. Survival rewarded people who noticed small things. Nearly 2 weeks passed before another human stepped onto Broken Eagle Mountain. Nathan Briggs climbed slowly through fresh snow carrying a lantern. His boots slipped several times before reaching the ledge. When he finally saw the stone wall, he stopped. His eyes moved across every careful layer. Then toward the smoke rising above it. He had expected to find an abandoned shelter. Instead, he found a home. Evelyn stepped into the entrance with her father's rifle resting across both hands. The weapon held no bullets. Nathan did not know that. Neither of them spoke at first. Snow drifted quietly between them. Nathan finally cleared his throat. "You can't stay here forever." Evelyn never lowered the rifle. "I've already stayed longer than you expected." Nathan glanced at the wall again. His face tightened. "You should come back before the real storms arrive." She looked toward the valley below. "I already know what waits for me there." Nathan reached inside his coat. For one brief second, Evelyn tightened her grip. Instead of drawing a weapon, he pulled out folded papers. "The council says the cabin legally belongs to me now." Evelyn recognized the handwriting even from several feet away. The same papers hidden beneath her mother's fireplace. The same lie. She looked directly into Nathan's eyes. "You already took my house." Her voice remained calm. "You won't take this mountain." Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. The wind rose between them. Finally, he turned around and began walking back toward Red Willow without another word. Evelyn watched until he disappeared beneath the trees. Only then did she lower the rifle. She leaned against the stone wall she had built with bleeding hands. Far below, dark clouds were gathering over the valley, and the mountain was about to reveal the secret that would change every life in Red Willow forever. Snow began before dawn. Not the light powder that drifted quietly across the ridge. This snow came sideways. The wind slammed against Evelyn's stone wall so hard that loose flakes shot through the narrow entrance like handfuls of sand. She fed another stick into the fire. Then another. Outside, the mountain disappeared behind a curtain of white. Inside, every sound became smaller. Every crack from the fire mattered. Every glowing stone mattered. Every handful of wood mattered. She had built this place one piece at a time. Now the mountain would decide whether it had been enough. The storm did not stop after one day. It grew stronger. Trees bent until their branches scraped the frozen ground. Snow piled halfway up the entrance wall. The small opening that allowed smoke to escape slowly narrowed beneath drifting snow. Twice each day, Evelyn crawled outside with a wooden shovel she had carved from split pine. She cleared the opening before it sealed completely. Without it, smoke would fill the hollow. With it blocked, the fire would become her enemy. On the third morning, she checked her rabbit snare. Nothing. The next one. Nothing. The third held only broken wire where something larger had forced its way through. She quietly rolled the damaged wire into a small coil. Nothing on the mountain lasted forever. Not food, not tools, not strength. Only work continued. She returned carrying armloads of evergreen branches. Instead of burning them immediately, she spread them across the outside of the stone wall. Snow collected inside the branches instead of blowing directly against the rocks. By afternoon, another layer of frozen snow had formed naturally around the wall. Stone, branches, packed snow. 3 layers stood between her and the wind. She smiled softly. The storm itself had become part of her shelter. That evening she noticed something else. The smoke no longer escaped straight upward. It curled against the low stone roof before sliding toward the opening. Warm air always climbed first. Cold air stayed near the floor. She stared at the movement for several minutes. Then she picked up another flat stone. By midnight, she had built a small curved shield behind the fire. Instead of allowing heat to rise uselessly toward the ceiling, the stones reflected part of it back toward the sleeping area. The difference arrived within an hour. Her blanket stayed warmer. The heated slate beneath the moss held its warmth longer. She rested one hand against the wall. Every mistake she survived had quietly become another lesson. Halfway through the 4th day, the storm changed. The wind faded. That should have been good news. Instead, silence covered the mountain. Her father had warned her about this. When the wind suddenly disappears during winter, the worst snow usually follows. He had been right. By sunset, thick snow poured from the sky without stopping. Each hour another foot buried the ridge. Far below, Red Willow began disappearing. Barn roofs vanished beneath white hills. Fences disappeared first, then wagons, then entire paths between houses. People shoveled until they could no longer lift their arms. Animals crowded together inside freezing barns. Smoke rose from every chimney. But the woodpiles became smaller each day. The village had prepared for winter. No one had prepared for this. Nathan Briggs stood outside his cabin before sunrise. The snow already reached his waist. His wife pulled the door open behind him. The sheep pen is gone. Nathan hurried toward the hillside. The fence had collapsed during the night. Half the flock had wandered into the storm. The rest huddled beneath broken rails, shaking beneath layers of snow. Nathan searched until darkness. He returned with only 4 sheep. 12 never came back. Across the village, another roof collapsed. Then another. The church lost part of its porch. One chimney cracked straight down the middle after freezing too quickly. Children stayed wrapped beneath blankets all day. Older men burned furniture because firewood had nearly disappeared. No one said it aloud, but everyone had begun counting food instead of days. High above them, Evelyn watched the valley through a narrow gap between 2 pines. Only a few thin columns of smoke still reached the sky. Too few. She lowered the small wooden cup in her hands. Something was wrong. Very wrong. On the 7th morning, she climbed farther along the ridge, searching for dry timber trapped beneath rocky ledges. Halfway across the slope, she froze. Fresh boot prints. Not animal tracks. Human. Only one person. The prints stopped behind a group of snow-covered pines overlooking her shelter. Someone had stood there, watching. The snow inside each footprint remained sharp, only a few hours old. Evelyn slowly lifted her father's rifle. The mountain stayed silent. Whoever had been there was already gone. She followed the tracks downhill. After nearly 100 yards, they disappeared beneath drifting snow. She searched another 15 minutes. Nothing, only white hills and twisted pines. She finally returned to the hollow. The fire still burned. Everything remained untouched, yet someone now knew exactly where she lived. The next morning, another sound reached the ridge. Not wolves, not wind. Voices, very faint. Carried upward through the frozen valley, Evelyn stepped onto the ledge. 3 figures slowly climbed toward Broken Eagle Mountain. They stopped often. One man stumbled to both knees before standing again. The climb itself looked painful. When they finally reached the stone wall, Evelyn recognized them immediately. Caleb Turner, old Martha Collins, Nathan Briggs. None of them looked like they had 2 weeks earlier. Their coats hung loosely. Their faces had become thin. Snow covered their beards and shoulders. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Caleb removed his hat. His hands shook from the cold. His voice barely rose above the wind. "We've buried 7 people." Silence. "The livestock are dying." Another silence. "The barns keep freezing." He looked directly at the wall Evelyn had built. Then toward the warm smoke drifting quietly above it. His shoulders slowly lowered. "We were wrong." Nathan lowered his eyes. Martha stood perfectly still. Caleb swallowed once before speaking again. "Please." The word almost disappeared in the wind. "Show us how you survived." Evelyn looked at the 3 faces before her. Only weeks earlier, these same people had watched her leave the village carrying everything she owned. Now they had climbed the mountain searching for the knowledge they believed she never had. She stepped aside. "Come inside." The 3 entered the hollow slowly. Caleb stopped almost immediately. His eyes moved across every detail. The layered stone wall, the heated slate beneath the moss bed, the curved reflector behind the fire, the carefully stacked wood. Nothing had been built by chance. Nathan reached toward one of the warm stones beside the fire. He pulled his hand back in surprise. "It still holds heat." Evelyn nodded. For hours, Martha quietly touched the moss beneath the blanket. Then looked up at Evelyn. "You figured all this out?" Evelyn answered softly. "No." She glanced toward the mountain outside. "I listened." None of them spoke again. Only the fire crackled between them. Outside, the blizzard had not finished with Red Willow, and before it finally ended, the entire village would have to decide whether pride was worth more than survival. The fire burned low while the 4 of them sat inside the hollow. No one hurried to speak. Outside, The wind pushed another wave of snow against the stone wall. Inside, the air remained still. Caleb Turner slowly reached toward the heated slate beside the fire. He left his hand there for several seconds. When he finally pulled it back, he looked at Evelyn with eyes that carried none of the authority he had worn in the village square. Only questions. Evelyn picked up one of the dark slate stones. She carried it to the fire. This stone stays here until it drinks enough heat. She laid it back on the moss bed. Then it gives that heat away little by little while you sleep. Nathan watched every movement. His lips parted slightly. We've been burning twice as much wood every night. Evelyn nodded. Because your fires are heating the air. She touched the stone again. I'm heating the night. Caleb stood and walked toward the entrance. He examined the wall carefully. His fingers pressed against the frozen mud packed between the rocks. You left this opening on purpose, so smoke can leave. And the wind. It climbs over the wall instead of crossing the floor. Caleb lowered his head. For nearly a minute he said nothing. Then he whispered almost to himself. We never thought about the wind. They stayed until afternoon. Before leaving, Martha quietly placed a cloth bundle beside Evelyn. Inside were 4 potatoes, a small piece of smoked venison, 2 candles. Evelyn looked up. I can't take these. Martha smiled gently. You already paid for them. She glanced around the hollow. We're only catching up. By sunset, the 3 villagers reached Red Willow. No meeting had been planned. No bell had been rung. Still, people gathered. Word spread faster than smoke. Nathan carried warm slate stones into the church first. Caleb ordered every family to bring flat rock from the creek before morning. Children collected moss beneath cedar trees. Women mixed clay with straw and packed cracks beneath cabin walls. Men rebuilt animal shelters using low double stone barriers instead of loose wooden boards. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. The mountain had settled every argument already. For 3 straight days, the entire village worked. Old fireplaces gained stone backs that reflected heat into the rooms. Sleeping beds were lifted off frozen floors with moss, pine boughs, and wooden slats. Heated stones moved from fireplace to blanket every evening. Barn entrances were narrowed. Wind channels disappeared. Wood piles began lasting longer. Animals that had stood shaking through the night finally rested. The difference was small the first evening, noticeable the second. By the 4th night, everyone understood. The mountain girl's ideas were working. Then came the coldest night anyone could remember. The temperature dropped so low that water buckets froze beside burning fireplaces. Tree trunks cracked across the valley before sunrise. Yet, when daylight returned, every family opened its door. Every child stepped outside. No new funeral bell rang. For the first time since the blizzard began, no one had been lost. A week later, the storm finally broke. Blue sky appeared above the valley. Snow sparkled across the hills like scattered glass. People stepped outside and simply stood in the sunlight. Some looked toward Broken Eagle Mountain. None spoke. They all knew whose hands had changed the ending. 3 days later, Caleb climbed the mountain again. This time, he did not come alone. Nearly every family followed behind him. Men, women, children. Even Nathan Briggs walked near the back of the line carrying a wooden crate across his shoulders. When they reached the hollow, nobody crossed the stone wall until Evelyn stepped outside. The crowd remained silent. Caleb removed his hat. We've come to return something. Nathan walked forward first. He placed the wooden crate gently on the ground. Inside lay the property papers. The same papers that had stolen her home. Nathan held them with both hands. I knew what my father planned before your mother passed. His voice caught. I stayed quiet because it gave me a house. He lowered his eyes. I've carried that silence every day since. He handed the papers to Evelyn. They were never mine. Caleb unfolded another document. This one belongs to you. Evelyn looked down. It carried the council seal, her father's cabin, the surrounding land, the small well behind it, Everything restored. No conditions. No payment. No argument. Only signatures. Every council member had written their name beneath it. Even Nathan. Evelyn looked at the papers for several seconds. Then she folded them carefully. She did not smile. She simply asked one question. What about everyone else? Caleb looked confused. The mountain shelters. She pointed toward the valley below. Leave them standing. The next winter won't ask permission before it comes. Caleb slowly nodded. They'll stay. Spring arrived slowly. Snow retreated from the lower hills. The creek found its voice again. Grass pushed through the frozen ground. Broken Eagle Mountain no longer looked empty. Small stone shelters began appearing along the lower slopes. Hunters built them. Shepherds copied them. Travelers rested inside them during storms. People stopped calling them hiding places. They started calling them Harper shelters. Evelyn returned to her father's cabin. She repaired the porch, planted potatoes beside the well, mended the old fence one rail at a time. Some evenings she climbed back to the mountain, not because she had nowhere else to go, because part of her would always belong there. The first stone still rested exactly where she had placed it. The rough wall still turned the wind upward. The moss bed had grown thicker with spring rain. Nothing about it looked grand. It simply worked. Years later, children asked why the shelters stood across the mountains. Their parents never spoke first about the blizzard. They spoke first about an 18-year-old orphan who had been sent away with almost nothing. They spoke about bleeding hands, carefully stacked stones, quiet observation, and one decision that changed an entire valley. High above Red Willow, the old stone wall remained. Each winter the wind struck it. Each winter it climbed over the top and disappeared into the sky. The wall still held, and so did the story. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful frontier survival stories.